Thank you again for joining us here today. As Dr. Diamond said in the theater, my name is Megan McGinley. I am the Director of Education at Sag Harbor Cinema. This is our inaugural Lighthouse event, so it is heartwarming, to say the least, to have you all here to discuss adolescent mental health with Florian Zeller's film, The Sun, as an entry point for this discussion. A very special thank you to the Florian Smith family for sponsoring the Lighthouse project, Bill Collage, Dr. Diamond, and Susan Mead of the Sag Harbor Cinema Board for their continuous support, and of course, the staff of Sag Harbor Cinema for all of their help. I'd also like to thank the organizations that have dedicated their time and materials for this event: OLA's YouthConnect, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and the Long Island Association for Mental Health and Wellness. Before we get started, I'd like to formally introduce our esteemed moderator, Dr. Diana Diamond. Dr. Diamond is a psychoanalytic clinician, professor, and researcher with private practices in New York City and Sag Harbor. She is a senior fellow at the Personality Disorders Institute, professor emerita in the doctoral program at the City University of New York, adjunct professor at New York University's postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and if that wasn't enough, she's also on the faculty at the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. She has written and lectured internationally about the intersection of film and psychoanalysis. Diana?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Megan, for that introduction. And even with all of those degrees and positions, I find myself kind of speechless in front of this film, I have to tell you, and I can imagine what you're feeling, because this is the third time I've seen it, so it wasn't like I wasn't prepared. And I also want to say I'm very gratified to see the audience reaction. I mean, the film has been very polarizing. Now that you've seen it, I can say this. It's gotten some very good reviews, it's gotten some very bad reviews. Interestingly enough, because I think it's a great initial film to use for our launch of talking about mental health issues, and particularly the crisis we're in right now of adolescent depression and suicidality. So to see your reactions is very heartening for me. And I hope, however you come to this, whatever your personal experience is, and I was just talking to someone about how this film can't help but bring you back to your own adolescence and the struggles therein, regardless of what that was like, or the adolescence of your children, or the adolescence of your friends' children. So it's, I think it's actually quite a brilliant film about that developmental passage, but very, very disturbing because of what it says about what's going on in our society right now. So let me just say that, it is a quite disturbing and difficult film to watch. One critic referred to it as a wrecking ball, almost exquisite in its destructive power. And it said it leaves the viewer in a fetal position, feeling paralyzed and unable to move. Well, luckily you all made it up here. But I do understand that sort of psychologically, it is kind of a wrecking ball. And it is very powerful. So we're going to keep that in mind as we go forward with our discussion. I'm sure that many of you have comments you want to share. I want to introduce our panelists, and then I want to just share a few other reflections on why it's so important for you to be here today, why it's so important for ordinary citizens, parents, teachers, whatever walk of life you're in, to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of depression in adolescence, and to be able to be an advocate, and because you are really on the front line of treatment. Believe it or not, we have very, very inadequate treatment facilities for adolescents. Those of you, I see people nodding your head, so those of you who are in the field know this very well. And clinicians are now just flooded. Not only psychologists, social workers, and psychiatrists, but pediatricians. interestingly enough, it's now the case that over half of pediatric and young adult medicine visits are about mental health issues. They're about depression, suicidality, substance abuse, anxiety, and pediatricians really are not equipped to handle this. In fact, many of them are going back for retraining. And in fact, my colleague here, Daniel Knoepflmacher, is actually involved in an education program for pediatricians at Weill Cornell. Okay, so let me just say a couple of things. I want to introduce my colleagues first and foremost. Okay, so Dr. Daniel Knoepflmacher is Vice Chair for Education in Psychiatry and Training Director of the General Psychiatry Residency Program at the New York-Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. He worked as an outpatient psychiatrist across diverse clinical settings. I think he's also done inpatient work, is my understanding. I think we all have here on this panel. So we're familiar with that last scene of having to involuntary or facing the reality of should you hospitalize your family member or not. I know he's been a tremendous support to families going through having their young adult child recover from depression and other mental health challenges. Additionally, and this is something very special about Daniel, he hosts the podcast On the Mind. And that's a really terrific podcast, which, believe it or not, Cornell is now very proud of this, that they actually are having podcasts on mental health issues. And I urge you all, whether you're in the field or not, to listen to this podcast because it's actually very, it's for professionals, but it's also for a lay audience who's just interested in learning more. Okay, so welcome, Daniel, and then I want to introduce our other panelist, Angelica Ortiz. Angie serves as YouthConnect Program Coordinator at OLA, and it's a role she's held since December of 2023. She has a foundational degree in social work from Ecuador and a Master of Social Work from Stony Brook's University School of Social Welfare in New York. She brings over a decade of dedicated experience working with Latino youth and families. Her expertise includes case management, counseling services to youth and families, and interpreting and translating for newly arrived Latino students and families on Long Island's East End. I just want to say one word about this program because it is funded. It's funded, and I'm going to ask Angie to tell you more about OLA and more about the YouthConnect program. But this is the kind of program we desperately need. This is a primary prevention program in the school for all students, cross-culturally, and it, I think, probably serves a tremendous preventative function. And Angie will talk more about that. In addition, I want Angie to talk a little bit about her own personal experience of coming from Ecuador and retraining as a social worker and how important that is for us to give people the opportunities because we're so deficient in not just mental health personnel, but mental health personnel who can serve the Latino community. Okay, and then I just want to say another word about Megan McGinley, our Director of Education. I can't say enough about how organized, competent, agentic Megan is, and how much she's helped in developing the Lighthouse project. But she has another life also. She's getting a PhD in film from Vanderbilt, and we all benefit from her expertise there. And she's a specialist in French film, particularly the French New Wave, particularly the Truffaut's films, and we're really hoping that at some point we can do a Truffaut Film Festival at the cinema. John and I have been advocating for that for a long time. At Vanderbilt, not surprisingly, she was honored for her pedagogical ingenuity and excellence in the classroom. So thank you, Megan. I can't thank you enough. Okay, now I'm going to turn, I have some questions and I'm going to turn it over to the panelists, but I just want to say another word about why it's so important for us to know the signs and symptoms of adolescent depression. We know this is a public health issue of huge magnitude. It spans ethnic and socioeconomic groups. This is very important to know. In fact, the fastest growing group of suicidal adolescents are Black individuals. So this is quite a disturbing phenomenon that's going on in our society now. Plus, boys are actually, although girls make more suicide attempts, boys are 5 times more likely to actually kill themselves, and by lethal means. So in that sense, this film is very timely, because we do have an uptick in boys who are suicidal. So let me turn now to our first question. And this is really pretty basic. To what extent do the panelists, and I'm going to start with Daniel, see this film as representative of what happens in adolescent depression when it's really serious? And how do we distinguish the normal emotional turmoil of adolescence? You know, we've all either had adolescents or had contact with adolescents. We know that they're moody. We know that they can be aggressive. We know we get huge fights with them and they storm out and all of those things. But how do we distinguish that mood instability from its normative aspects of mood instability from the psychiatric disorder of adolescent depression? Can the adolescent manage feelings? Does life feel overwhelming? Do they have the capacity for affect regulation or not? Or are they overwhelmed by feelings, unduly dysregulated by them, or conversely cut off completely from them, as we saw Nicholas was in this film? And I think that's a very, very important thing to recognize. Okay, so Daniel.
Oh, it's on. Thank you, Diana, and it's wonderful to be here with you and Angie, and really want to extend a thank you to Megan as well, and the planning that we all did in going into this. This is my introduction to the Sag Harbor Cinema, and I'm just so thrilled to be a part of this series, which is, I think, a real gift to the community. So thank you. So where do I start? Taking apart the question, I would begin by saying something that you alluded to. We've all been adolescents. We have all had adolescence in our lives. We all know that it is a time of turmoil, growth, and a lot of change. And I think anyone who has been an adolescent or who has experienced an adolescent knows that there is a lot more expressive emotion that occurs during that period. There can be a lot of sadness, a lot of anger. There can be, a lot of reactivity to what's going on, and impulsivity, and sometimes even irrationality. That said, depression is a distinct entity that's separate from that. So I want to think of adolescents as full human beings, because they are, of course, and snowflakes, not in the pejorative sense, but in the fact that every one of us is a complete individual. So if you think about a Charlie Brown Eeyore adolescent versus, give me an example of someone who's very ebullient and happy all the time. If you look at either of those two individuals experiencing depression, it's going to look different. So there's a lot of variability. Still, there are common factors that the movie actually did a good job of showing. And a lot of these are similar to depression as it presents in adults as well, but some of them tend to be more prominent with adolescents. So I'll go through some of those. The low mood, of course, and the negative outlook is something that is obviously a hallmark, that psychological state of negativity, feelings of hopelessness, which you really felt from Nicholas. Actually, that inability to talk about it, which Nicholas seemed to embody, again, just dealing with adolescents who you want to, hey, what did you do today? You often say, I don't know. Those are responses you're going to get anyway, but with depression, that's going to be even more difficult for them to share what are really some of the most painful emotions and experiences they've ever had in their lives. There's a change in sleep often. Sometimes there can be what we call medically hypersomnolence, which means that there's a lot of sleeping all the time, or conversely, there can be kind of an energetic not sleeping, where kids are up all night and maybe sleeping some during the day, but are really disrupting those normal circadian rhythms that are so important at that age. Additionally, appetite. I noticed he didn't eat a lot in the film, and there was a little, back and forth with the Cheerios, but he refused the coffee in the morning. Often there can be decreased appetite, but also conversely, there can be overeating and eating almost as a comfort, maybe more prone to junk food, things like that. There is something that exists in depression in general, but is more prominent in adolescence, and that is irritability. And we certainly, I think, witness that in the film as well. And then, of course, the presence of suicidal ideation is a hallmark of depression. Now, that can be in a full range. It could be, I just wish I didn't have to live anymore. I get up in the morning and feel like I wish there was just an escape from the hopelessness of my life, to actively planning some a suicidal act, or impulsively in the moment when things get so overwhelming that there might be a suicide attempt. And then we also saw in the film, which I think is important to see, self-injurious behavior, which can be associated with depression. Now, it can happen in adolescence even when there isn't depression. So it's distinct, but it certainly can happen with depression. And I think that was one thing that was portrayed really, I think, effectively when he described his father completely not understanding and sort of saying, why would you do this? You're hurting me. He described how it actually alleviated the emotional pain that he was feeling inside. So those are, I think, a lot of the hallmark elements of it. I'm sure I'm missing a few others. Any that come to mind, Angie, that I'm not thinking about?
I wanted.
No, I was going to turn to you, Angie, and just say.
Thank you. Yeah,
I'd
no,
love
the
to
only
hear
thing.
what you're observing in the schools and add to what Daniel said.
Yes, thank you for that. The only thing I wanted to add to what Daniel was saying is that if you notice something that is happening in very repetitive occasions, for example, if you see these patterns that Daniel just mentioned, but they happen often, you see them almost every day or 4 times a week, you know that there is something to be concerned about, right? Adolescents tend to be sad. Adolescents tend to be maybe hungrier some days than others, right? But when you notice these patterns often, that's when we have to really pay attention. And to add to the movie also, there was something that I noticed also with Dad, always asking these questions about, oh, how was school? How is the girl? How is the date, right? Those questions for Dad maybe meant something, but did they mean something for Daniel, for Nicholas, I mean? I think I noticed in schools, going back to what you mentioned, parents have conversations, but sometimes they're not that meaningful for teens, right? Parents want to know about grades. Of course, we're parents, right? We want to know about how they're doing in school. But do we really ask them, did you talk to your friend today? Or what friends do you have? What kind of relationships do you have in school? Those questions sometimes we don't get, right? And that will tell us a lot about our adolescents, right? How they're doing, if they really have friends. Some parents I've seen, they don't even notice if their students or their kids have friends because we don't ask the questions. Or sometimes the questions are just about how do you do in math? They're not really meaningful for teens. And believe it or not, they want to talk. They really want to talk. Sometimes in schools, they used to come to me a lot when I was working there in, my 10 years in school district. And they would tell me some things that probably parents didn't want to hear, about their friends. Oh, the drama with the friends. Parents probably don't have that time, right? But you see the need of them expressing those things, and they're important to them. So I will say or encourage, based on the movie and based on our conversation today, to get to those conversations that they want to talk about, not necessarily the ones that adults want to talk about, right? Because they don't want to know about our job. Have you seen teens coming and asking, how was your day at work? What did you do today, right? That's not really their main thing. But they definitely want to let it out. And it's good to be there and listen, really listen through those conversations because they will tell you a lot from them.
Thank you, Angie. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about YouthConnect and just describe the program and also just couple of sentences on OLA for people who aren't from this area and don't know that much about OLA. And then also say a word about your own trajectory, which I think is so interesting and so important for us to know about.
Of course. So some of you probably know OLA, some of you probably don't. OLA is an organization, Latin American organization that provides a lot of services to the community on the East End. When I talk about services, I talk about a lot of things. We do a lot of advocacy when it comes to immigration, a lot of advocacy when it comes to situations with work, with jobs, with home, a lot of advocacy with school districts that are not providing the services that parents need for their kids, many things. We also provide transportation to appointments for people who can't drive or don't drive, or they don't have any way to make it to the appointment. That is one crucial part of OLA, and we do a lot of art too. We also host the film festival. We also do a lot of cultural events, right? So if you really want to know more about OLA, I would say I left some flyers there, but also follow us because the events we do are always changing. We have new things coming up every time. Within OLA, we have YouthConnect, which is the text line. It's a text line that provides emotional support to teens. How did this start? Teens were asked what they needed. We ran a survey, I think, to probably over 100 students, and then we asked them what they needed. What is the support they think they need and they don't have yet? And what is the best way that they will receive it? We found out that many of them rather keep things confidential, of course, and also in an accessible way, texting, right? They love to text, they have their phones. Most of the teens have phones. That's how YouthConnect started. It was just answers from teens that led to the program be created. Started with 3 crisis counselors who were on the text line. We respond to texts. Teens text you from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. from about anything. It could be just to talk to someone. It could be to, share about a crisis that is happening. They really want to vent with someone or just ask you for an advice. So the text line provides that support. We always go to school districts and tell the teens, we are another friend that you can just talk to about whatever you want, right? So many of the teens do that. They just tell you, hey, I had a good day at school, or, oh, I had some problems with my friend. Awesome. But we have had a lot of teens sharing deep things, bigger than that, more difficult, crisis, and we have been able to provide that support via text. So many of the things we saw today in the movie, as the way that Nicholas was asking for help in a way that the parents did not recognize, all our crisis counselors are trained to do that, to get more information, to get the conversation going, to ask things about them in a way that they don't feel like attacked. Sometimes as parents, that is very difficult to do. On the text line, again, they don't know us, we don't know them much, so we try to keep the conversation as friendly as we can. Again, they're teens, so we try to bring that, energy for them, to be open and share with us. The text line is available to everyone in Spanish and in English. And I do want to mention that because on the East End, we do not have enough counselors that provide services bilingually, right? In Spanish or in English. Even in English right now, it's difficult. Imagine the Spanish side of that. So the text line is available to everyone. We try to keep it for teens mostly and young adults. But we have had adults reach out and say, hey, I need to talk to someone. Of course, we're not going to say no. So we do provide the support as well. It's not just text, it's also a phone call. So you can call, you can talk to any of us. And many adolescents get grounded, phones are removed, so we also do the email. Just for that. Believe me, they don't want to use emails, they don't want to be emailing, but yeah, parents take the phones away. So they need that support sometimes when that happens, so we are available via email. Yeah, from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. Quickly about my journey here, because I know I'm going too long. I grew up in Ecuador. I was born and raised there and moved to New York 10 years ago. I already studied social work in Ecuador, and I moved here and started working in the school district. But with that, I wasn't sure about continuing my education here as a social worker because of the difference with cultures and also the difference of how social work is practiced here in Ecuador, right? But the need with the teens, the need with the students is what brought me to it, because they were coming to the office every single day with more things. And my concern was always, what are they going to do after they go home, after school? Who do they go to? And their answer many times when I asked them, they said, well, my parents are working. I don't have anybody to talk to. So for me, that was a plus. I needed to do more, and the way I did it was like going to school, finishing my master's in social work, and now working with teens and adolescents in a way that I can be more support, not just me as one person, but as a team with YouthConnect, and hopefully now with these wonderful collaborations, to put it out there, to share more, that this support is very important. It's a resource that all teens have on the East End, and they should use it. So if you can help share it. If you have teens or families or anybody who needs this extra support or resource, please share it with them.
Yes, thank you so much, Angie. And I think what you're describing is a safe space for adolescents to talk about this issue, which has been sorely lacking. And obviously, it's very hard for them to talk to their parents about it, and also to their peers. So I think that's really, really important. I guess I had one other question I wanted to ask you, and it's just flown out of my head. I'm sorry. I'll come back to it in a minute. Yeah, I'll come back to it in a second. It had to do with the work in the schools. But anyway, I'll come back to it. Yeah, don't worry. But thank you so much. So I guess another question that I have for the panelists, and I'll also pitch in on this, is how does adolescent depression interfere with the developmental tasks of adolescence? Now, Daniel spoke a little bit about this, and I think it was really very interesting, but let's think about what those developmental tasks are. Differentiation of self from family of origin, right? That makes peer relationships so important for adolescents. Also establishing a personal identity, a unique identity. Now, we know that actually depression interferes with both of those developmental experiences in very drastic ways. And in fact, untreated adolescents who are depressed will tend to have recurrent depressions, often, not always. And every time they have a depression, there are changes in the brain. Maybe Daniel can talk a little bit more about that. But it puts them further behind developmentally at a time when their developmentally going forward is so crucial. And that's one of the parts of this film that I think is so incredibly poignant, when he tells his father he really has no friends, and he has no life, and he doesn't feel he can fit into the world, and he feels completely inadequate to meet the challenges of life, and really can't answer what's wrong. Keeps saying, I don't know, I don't know. That's a sign of severe identity diffusion. Here's a kid who's not going to school. So we have to differentiate between the ordinary identity confusion of adolescents, where they're trying to figure out who they want to be, what they want to do, and who their friend group is, and they might even have a negative identity for a while, which drives us crazy. But at least they're in the process of forming an identity. You can see how all of that got stopped for Nicholas. Anyway, do you want to say something more about that, Daniel?
Sure. I'll say a few things about the neurobiology, because we all see and have experienced what it looks like internally and externally, and the movie portrays that. But at normal adolescent development, the period of adolescence, which happens in terms of brain changes, happens a little later with girls than it does with boys. But in both cases, there's a major rewiring of the brain during that period. And it's frankly, I think, other than infancy and kind of toddlerhood, where the brain is learning so much, language, how to walk, all of these other things, it's probably the other big time in human development where there's so much change going on. And you alluded to that with depression, that's an inflammatory state within the brain. There's some changes, in terms of brain function that occur, which affect concentration and all of the things that we've listed. I do want to say, though, even though we're talking about depression, I don't want to be depressing in describing this, because I actually think there's a lot of hope in this period. There's a tremendous amount of resilience in human development. The brain is a plastic organ. And while I've seen it in my own life with family members. I've seen it with my work quite repeatedly, seeing people go through these developmentally, fraught or important periods, have a depression overlaid on that. It can be quite scary and sad to see things being missed out at that important developmental stage. But I have seen, with the right help and the right support, that can lead to a recovery where people go right back on that developmental track. And not only that, might have some, out of that resilience and life experience, might have some wisdom and experience that they bring to life as an adult that can help them. So I do think, as much as this film doesn't feel hopeful, and I do think there is hope in all of this, which we can talk more about.
Thanks, Daniel. Angie, do you want to add anything to that about what you're seeing in the schools developmentally, the kids who are really, reaching out for help, who might be moving toward a more serious depression or who are depressed?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we do see this often. And I think that is why we incorporated going to the school districts and be in person when we present about YouthConnect, because we get a face, we get to see them, right? And even just in the presentations, we always make it very interactive. But we do see some students who don't even want to join the presentations. They don't even want to hear about it, but they will know what we're talking about. And that is something that tells us, okay, there is a need here, but again, they're not coming to get it. Many of the students in the schools need the resources, but they don't know how to verbally go and say, I'm going through something. Hey, I am struggling. Hey, I don't know what to do, right? That's why we want to be there, and not just necessarily asking questions, but maybe even just be there as a support person. Just be there, keep that company. The students who need it the most sometimes are not the ones that speak or talk the most, right? So we've seen that a lot. But we continuously try to just add modify YouthConnect, try to help them in a way that they feel heard without necessarily just get them talking, if that makes sense. We try to make it very clear that one person sometimes can change your life. And as Daniel mentioned before, just be there for them. That's what we want. And even if they don't use the text line, even if they don't talk to their friends about it or family, we want them to know that we care about them. And I think at the end of the day, even in the movie we saw, they just want that. Teens in schools now these days, they just want a person. And oftentimes they don't have one, right? So I think that is the most important thing that I've noticed in schools. And with the text line, like they will tell us, they will be very honest that no, I don't have anybody, I don't have friends, I don't want to have friends. Like it's hard for them even to interact. That's why we see them now with the phone so much. Many students even tell us, hey, like I have better conversations with friends via text or via WhatsApp or Snapchat, whatever is happening now, than in person. Because sometimes they don't know what to say. They don't know how to have a conversation. So we're going in a different time right now where they are not forced to have these conversations in person, but they don't know who's teaching them these things, So we try to also be that resource to help them navigate these crazy times with them changing constantly, and as the community is changing too. As the times are changing, everything is a continuous change for them. So imagine with that and mental health, so the combination of those components can be really tricky for them. So we try to be there for them. And I encourage you all to also, if you have a person, just be there, listen, and keep that, company to them.
And also, I just want to make one point because I remembered what I wanted to say before, Angie. Also, to support programs like YouthConnect and OLA. This is really important, and actually there's some research. I'm going to ask Daniel to help me out with this, but there's some research done by somebody, I think at the University of Oregon, and who found that in states where the government, social services are giving to programs on youth mental health, kids are less depressed and they do better. So don't think it's only at the micro brain, familial level. We're going to get into the family in a minute. It also is the sense of a social network. Do kids feel there's a caring social network? Anyway, do you want to say something about that?
Mostly just to reiterate that point that there was research looking at Medicaid data and outcomes, and there are states where there was investment in youth care and support, and others, and not just that, but other social service programs helping with hunger, with other socioeconomic stressors. And there is a marked difference in those states in outcomes in terms of youth mental health. So this is, we're talking about all hands on deck at the level of the federal government, at the states, with organizations like OLA, with individual clinicians. This is with families. This is something where it needs to be a full court press.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think this is one of the most interesting studies that's been done, because it goes from the micro to the macro. And it also gives us something that we can invest in to really counter this youth mental health crisis. But let's move to family dynamics. And what are some of the family dynamics, both at what we see in the film, but also that might contribute to adolescent depression? I can tell you that family discord and negative relationships with families are highly involved in precipitating and correlated with the development of depression in adolescence and suicidality. And so I think it's really important we can start with the film and talk about what should parents not be doing with their adolescents. What was going on in this family, that this was a kid who was crying out for help in his inarticulateness, you see, in his totally being shut down, in his inability to function, and yet the parents kept exhorting him to function. And not only that, but it was clear that he had very inadequate, I'm going to use a term you all may know or not know, separation individuation from his parents. In other words, he didn't have a differentiated sense of self, which by the age of 17, we see, and I'm sure some of you have seen kids who've been through the most horrendous circumstances: abuse, dislocation, family violence, and they don't develop clinical depression in this way. So I think that's very interesting. There is a factor of genetic resilience and probably some good person there, a grandparent, a teacher, somebody who's buffering this for the child. I'd like both of you to talk more about this, but I think, let me finish with separation individuation. So you can see the lack of differentiation of Nicholas's self from his father's. He says to him, the father says to him, "When you hurt yourself, you're hurting me." And Nicholas replies, "When you hurt mom, you hurt me." Now, there's very little differentiation between his own sense of himself and what's going on with his father on both sides, interestingly enough. And you get hints of where that might come from when you see Peter with his own father. And you see how much his father imposed on Peter his own expectations and definition of who Peter should be, never allowing him to really differentiate, although it's much less severe than it is with Nicholas. So I don't know if the two of you want to add anything to that.
I just want to mention something now that we're on the family topic, because it's very different in cultures. I think we have a diverse, cultural group here, on the East End especially, but families are families everywhere. And I do think expectations play a very important role in how our teens develop. Most of us, of course, want to see our teens, adolescents succeed, but many don't know the right way to say it or to put it out there for our teens. Sometimes we're just expecting the best of them, their best behavior, their best attitude, their best energy every single day. But now we don't consider what they're going through. They're just in the process of learning also. And that's where we come in where we play the important role. Teens are looking, and that is what I see in the schools. That's what I see with the families I work. They are listening, absolutely everything. They are seeing you. They are not, if you think they're not paying attention, they are. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we don't realize, but they're doing what they're seeing. So they're doing what we are doing, right? And sometimes we don't like it, but guess what? We show them how to do it, right? So I want to add the point that before we provide support, or before we tell a teen, before we tell anyone, or especially adolescents, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this, you're doing that, let's look into ourselves first. Let's hear what we say and how we're saying it, because our words matter a lot for them. If we just come and tell them like how we want it to be, it's not what we want. It's also how they see it, how they perceive it, right? And they need to feel that they care, of course, but sometimes we make it sound like, just do this because I want you to be successful, or do it because I didn't do it, Like we try to put this pressure on them because it comes from us, right? So I do want to point out that as parents or as any kind of support that we are for a teen, we should always look into ourselves. And also how we say it, right? The father in the movie yelled at him, right? He lost it in a way. But what did that lead to? What did that lead to, right? It wasn't really helpful. So even before we go and yell at a teen for something, of course, they didn't do right, we should do that checkup on us, right? Okay, let's calm down because it's not going to be productive, and then let's go and have a conversation. And again, not about us, but about them. That's what we're trying to do. Something I notice a lot, too, in the movie, and not just in the movie, but with the students I work with. They always say that, oh, my mom didn't have it that easy, right? So she had a really hard time growing up. So now I have to do better. I have to be better. And that's what we keep bringing, okay? If I had a really tough life, I want my kid to acknowledge that, right? But I don't want my kid to be responsible for how hard my life was, right? And we put that pressure on them a lot, and they feel it. They know that, okay, my mom maybe moved to this country to give me a better life, and now I'm here with my grades that are low. I feel like I'm a completely disappointment. So those things can be very tough for them. So I would say even when we support a teen or adolescent, like keep those things in mind. Whatever you went through, but they're not responsible for that. And for parents, for anybody out there helping them, just keep that in mind all the time, because it can be out there without us noticing.
Yeah.
Thank you. If you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, you said it all. I don't want to add that. That was great.
Should we open
I just
the floor?
want to bring up, I'm sorry.
Should we open the floor to
Yes.
questions soon?
Yes, in 1 second. I just want to bring up two other family dynamics, which I think are brilliantly done in the film and very important to think about. One is idealization. The little sunbeam, all of those idyllic flashbacks, you can see that somehow this kid might have been overprotected as a younger child, leaving him without the resources to face the challenges that he had to face when he was going into adolescence. So that's just one thought. And the last scene after the suicide, where you have, the father fantasizing that his son has written a book, Death Can Wait, and he's dedicated it to the father, really says it all about idealization. That is such an idealized fantasy to avoid grieving and mourning the loss of his son and the reality of who his son was, which he really could never accept. And the other thing is, and this is very hard to talk about, is aggression. The aggressiveness of Nicholas towards his parents, his rage, and how he finds the vulnerable places in his father and stepmother to avoid, to some extent, not because he's not right about some of the things he's confronting them on, but to avoid facing his own issues and how really disturbed he is. So I think this is something that goes on in families. Anyway, yes, I think we should open it up. Thank you.
Yeah, if you can pass your note cards this way to me and on the other side to Diana in the striped sweater.
I think we have some questions. So should we?
Oh, yeah, there was
Yeah,
somebody
we'll
who
collect
had a
note
question.
cards for everyone that would like.
And there's somebody behind you, too, had a question. I
Yeah,
think you had
so,
a question first.
We'll collect these. Thank you, Diana. And we'll have a microphone for anyone that would like to voice their questions. Yeah, here we go.
That was very interesting about the texting because, having had a child grow up in this area, yes, there was really a dearth of resources. But it's very, the hardest thing was what to say to them, which was very obvious in the film. So, should we be texting them?
Well, if that is easier for parents to get more information, I would say yes.
No, but you're saying that is the way they communicate. And I'm just thinking, it's the thing. They come home and you say, how was your day? Or you try all kinds of avenues. You don't get anywhere. And maybe you said they do better with text. They're texting the helpline. Maybe we should become a text line.
That's true. Like, why exactly? Why I think it's a good way to investigate what works for your child, right? Not all kids like to text, right? Some kids like, or no kids, I keep referring to kids because I see them like kids, but adolescents, not all like to text, right? So find what works for your teen, but also not for you, I think we're very, as parents or as adults, we feel like we know it all. Like we don't really. Like this whole adolescent texting, even for us in the text line, we do it every day, and every single day we learn something new. Like the way they communicate, like they keep making the words shorter and shorter every time. And we're like, okay, where is this coming from? Like we educate ourselves every single day because there are new topics that come up now. There are new things happening, new games that we had no idea existed, But as parents, I think we all should do the same thing, even to have a conversation about the new game that your kid is playing. Let's say, let's Google it. Let's see what this Fortnite type of thing is, So we have a conversation that they like to participate on.
I think there's a rule of thumb that you meet your child where they are, and everyone's an individual. If texting is the right mode, that's going to be great. Open-ended questions, which are great for cocktail conversation with adults, don't always work so well with teens. You might have to go for some close-ended questions, which I mean have a yes or no answer or a few-word answer rather than what's the meaning of life. Those approaches I think help draw them out. But listen, collect information, and then meet them where they are, I think is the rule of thumb, because we're not the experts on anybody's individual children. We just have experience working with lots of adolescents and young adults.
And it's gonna be fun to learn about emojis too. Learn about emojis, like they communicate with emojis now. So it's like, okay, what are you trying to say with this? I mean, these are new things, right? It's changing, so.
Yeah.
I'm telling you.
We didn't talk about sexual development either, which is a very important thing that occurs
Yes.
in adolescence.
Absolutely. Let's see, there was another, Wendy, did you have a question before we turn to these questions?
Hi, I just had an observation and a question. One of the things I really noticed in Nicholas is his kind of disconnection from the people around him, not just his family, but obviously his classmates. And I think what you see a lot in adolescent depression too is disassociation, and that's absolutely a protective mechanism. But I could see some parents thinking, I just don't know how to get through to my kid. I just don't, and either giving up or trying to be more overbearing. And to that end, I would think it would be amazing if there were more resources for parents and caregivers on how to engage with their children, and also what to look for. What are some of the very specific symptoms to see in their child? Do they not have any friends coming over, or are they overeating or undereating? And even I was just thinking how to make that more available, and maybe it's just a series over Zoom where there's no fee and parents can, where they can ask questions, or panelists or whatever, but there has to be, because parents are on the front lines, and we need to know what to look for and then how to engage in a safe way just by opening up things. And because you could see these parents were kind of impatient, trying to get an answer, and if they couldn't, they get frustrated. And a lot of that is driven by fear. When they're not getting any answer from their child, they get so fearful, understandably. So
I'm really glad you brought up the issue of dissociation. I think Richard wants to say something, and then this gentleman also wants to follow.
Thanks. A couple things, but really in terms of your question, before that, this is, the seagull, Chekhov's the seagull. If there's a gun on the stage, it's going to go off. So we know where this movie's going from as soon as Hugh Jackman says, behind the washing machine is a gun. So that's inevitable. And the film basically sets up that everything leads to the plausibility of his suicide. The parents ask the wrong questions. The psychiatric system behaves incorrectly, so that we get to the conclusion that the movie is going, which means this is not a good model for how to talk to your child. In fact, it's a disaster because everyone always asks the same question. Nicholas always answers the same way, and the question's repeated.
Yeah.
There are other models in cinema for a much better way to ask adolescents, such as Good Will Hunting and Ordinary People, where the psychiatric system and the people in the movie actually respond to adolescents in a way that adolescents think and talk.
Yes.
As adolescents, you don't think logically. That's part. So to ask him, why would you do this? Why would you do this? Why would you do this? Is to ask for a rebellion. And that's what you get. So it's really a question of not what questions to ask, but how to behave.
Yeah.
And
How to
we
engage
have to
your
change
child.
our behavior. You can't ask the adolescent to come up to good cognitive
Yes.
impulse control.
Yes, and I really appreciate that. But
I would just want to point out that Dr. Brockman is speaking also as a psychiatrist and as someone who knows about playwriting and film. So I think comes with some authority on this.
yes, and as someone who understands about dissociation. And I guess I would say we thought about those two films you mentioned, but I think it was precisely because they have a happy ending that we decided, and also if they're a little overexposed, we wanted to use a film that hasn't been seen very much in this country, that's controversial, and where it's a failure in a sense, where there is a suicide because there is so much suicide right now. And so it opens the door to think about why. And I think this point about dissociation is extremely important because he cuts himself in a dissociated state. You know, when I was thinking about self-injury in the film, I came across a study that said half of adolescents engage in self-injury of one sort or another, which means inflicting tissue damage on themselves in one form or another. Or I would include things like scratching, biting, head banging, and so on. So this is an astonishing thing that we have created a society where half of our adolescents are hurting themselves in one way or another. And if you talk to any teacher, and I know that we've talked about this, Angie, that cutting is a huge issue. Parents are on that helpline talking about it. The kids are talking about it. They're talking about how their peers are doing it. They're doing it everywhere. They're doing it, you know, in working class, across ethnic groups, and they're doing it in private schools in New York. And so this is a cross-cultural, cross-class issue. And we have to ask ourselves, what is it about our society and our families that is leading to this? So that's just a question I think we should be considering. But yes, next time we'll use, it's a good point. Exactly.
Hi, I'll keep this quick, but one of the things we didn't touch upon that I saw and noticed a lot was the whole father-son dynamic, which went through the father to the grandfather. We kept seeing him saying, I'm fine, I'm fine. He's told that his father's sick. He takes his phone, puts it away. It was just really glaring there, and how the script was repeating itself. And, you know, with his own son, whether he wanted to or not, he heard himself saying the very things that his own father said, that, you know, and the son, you know, lashed out at him. That really touched me.
Yeah, the multi-generational factors, which in my experience are usually there when you're looking at pathology in adolescence. You know, it goes beyond the immediate family situation, often into the, you know, grandparental or even above that. So it is important always to be considering the family. Yes, go
That
ahead.
really brings up the question of heredity and clinical diagnoses and the use, misuse, overuse of pharmaceutical interventions, which can cause their own problems, and really understanding the differentiation between going through adolescence and all these other factors, whether they're environmental or genetic, and the confluence of all possibilities of three. So when you talk about a grandparent and a father, and you can see that in behavior, but let's say the diagnoses of bipolar or OCD, and other brain issues that have to be clinically treated, or the problem with clinically treating,
Right. And I
which is
think
also a big problem.
yeah, and I want
Throwing
Daniel,
medicine at it, you know what I mean?
I want Daniel to speak to this too, but I think what you're saying is that depression is what we call a biopsychosocial illness or disorder.
Yeah.
And is different for each person, which is why I love film so much. It's why I need film and psychology, because I really, obviously cases are endlessly fascinating, and I often say each of my patients is like a Russian novel. But the bottom line is film gives you a structure, right? A narrative structure, and creates characters who very much are paradigmatic of what we're dealing with in our culture right now. And so I think it gives you another window. And film is more and more used to teach psychiatry and psychology students. But anyway, Daniel, do you want to comment
this,
on
but
that?
it's like COVID.
point?
Anxiety and depression is catching.
Yeah.
Well, I was actually going to bring up the biopsychosocial formulation, which is what we use in medicine and psychiatry and psychology, exactly as you're describing, and as Diana mentioned. Within the biological sphere, a lot of these things overlap. They're layered within each, and then they have overlap from one sphere to the next. But you think about genetics, there's allusion to maybe the fact that Hugh Jackman's character might have had some depression at an earlier age. It's unclear. Clearly, he had traumatic relationships with his parents. So there's whatever heredity there is, there's those diagnoses. I mean, this could be depression, it could be bipolar disorder, it could be they're distinct entities biologically. Exactly. And then on top of that, a big thing that we've touched on just briefly, but is a huge factor, is the use of substances, which is quite prevalent. Has a real biological impact on the brain. Exactly. And it also provides some psychological temporary relief, which of course is not, it makes things worse, but in the moment you might feel a little relief. So those all within the biological realm. The psychological realm overlaps with that generational, sometimes trauma or other generational patterns that go down, how that impacts the individual and the family psychology. Everybody has a personality, and we have multiple children, and they're not all the same. They all have distinct personalities. And is that personality going to mean that you're outgoing or you're introverted? Does it mean that you're going to be someone who's really risk-taking and bold, or very anxious and timid? Are you going to be somebody who's resilient and very flexible, or maybe there's some more rigidity around adjustments? And then lastly, which in some ways is the most complex, is the social piece, which has to do with a lot of the things we've been talking about with Angie today. I think the social factors, the economic factors, structural factors in our society, like that research that Diana mentioned, our politics right now impacting us socially. There's identities. This is a time when you're forming identities, and our identities are all complex with all these intersections between whether what our racial background is, our ethnic background, our sexuality, gender. How does that, you might really resonate with your family in some ways, but have an intersection with something else that takes you out of the house and makes you feel alienated from your family, and vice versa in other settings. So all of this complexity helps to bring into the assessment and treatment of somebody who's suffering from depression.
We have one more question back here.
Hi, I just wanted to say that the reviewer that you alluded to initially about the fetal position, I felt that this film was more like a primer for how not to do certain things with a kid who, he reached out in a couple of early scenes saying, life is engulfing me, and what he said was he's having dark thoughts. He revealed how seriously ill he was early on, and people minimized it. And it was funny that he projected onto the psychiatrist the asshole word, the same word he used for his father.
Yes.
And so,
And
Well, go ahead.
something that I wanted to add to that, also in the movie, there is a part where he's sitting with the therapist and he's telling the therapist exactly what the therapist wants to hear.
Exactly.
We hear this, we see these kids or adolescents exactly know what to say to the therapist. Or even when they're having suicidal thoughts or ideations, and they know they're going to be sent to get an examination with a doctor or something more in depth, they know the answers to that. And I'll tell you, because they have come to me and tell me, oh, I knew what to respond to those questions. We all know that if we say that we have suicidal thoughts, we're going to be sent somewhere else. They know the system. So, and that is something that the movie made or pointed out at, that the red flags are there. They know what to say or what route to take depending on what they want to go. So it's more about us paying the attention that we need to, so we recognize what to do and when to act.
Yeah. And unfortunately, yes, sure, go ahead.
As I'm listening, I was so upset by the movie itself because nobody was dealing with facilitating communication within the family and what the personality structures were, people in the family, the parents, or dealing with the underlying psychopathology of the kid, And I've always worked with kids and families, and that's the only way that I have really gotten through to them and that they've been able to change. It's hard. Yeah. But it was so upset, and you're right, the movies that you mentioned, were Ordinary People. They did do that. He did have some good therapy, and the father went in too. In this movie, nothing really. There was no attempt to say anything meaningful, and it was so disturbing to watch. I couldn't believe how upset I was by it because I know how painful that is. Yeah. So I just want to say that. I mean, it's complicated. The things you're talking about are great and meaningful. It's sort of the macro level. I mean, it's getting underneath all of that to the deeper issues,
No, I really appreciate your saying that because it is a very disturbing movie in that way. And yet, unfortunately, given the high suicide rates, I think we have to say that happens frequently. Even with kids who are in treatment, and so I think we have to ask ourselves why that happens. It's very hard to engage adolescents, and that's going to lead me to one of the questions on the note cards, which is, what's the best response for the parents when in the psychiatrist's office, the boy wants to go home, and the doctor says he should remain in the hospital? In the real world, should parents always listen to the doc? That's the toughest question to answer. My husband, who was sitting next to me, said, "Is this realistic, what happened here?" I said, "Unfortunately, it is with adolescents. Sometimes you're in the position of recommending hospitalization for the safety of the patient, and the parents, the child really doesn't want to." And the only thing I can tell you is that, the laws keep changing. Daniel should speak to this. And maybe Angie, if you're more familiar, I'm not working directly in inpatient units anymore, but there is a court process and the adolescent can fight it, but if you're concerned that individual is going to walk out of the office and kill themselves, you have a legal responsibility to hold them. And so I don't know how to answer this question. It's the toughest question to deal with. Daniel, do you want to say something?
I think that scene, the situation and the tension of a patient not wanting to stay in the hospital and have treatment, and the treatment team knowing that that's the right step is realistic. However, I don't think as Richard alluded to, the practice of what was done was very realistic at all, at least not in the experience that I've had, in that there was a tendency for the psychiatrist to make sure that it was all done in front of Nicholas. And I would say I would want to prepare parents in a discussion before you're sitting there with the child who's in great distress, and to then just sort of say, well, you guys have to make a decision now in front of him. That is pretty torturous and almost sadistic. So that piece of it, I think, was not particularly therapeutic or effective in this case. The laws are such that in this case, as it was alluded to, it depend if this is a child below 18, the parents are the guardians, and they would be the ones to make that decision and sign the paperwork if the person is going to stay in the hospital. The parents could object, and so this doctor gave them the opportunity to sign. We call this sign him out, to sign out of the hospital. They could have, the doctor could have said, I'm sorry, but I disagree with you as well, and I'm really worried for your son's safety, so we're going to have to go to court. And it would actually be the parents in court, with probably Nicholas as well, and the doctor arguing before a judge to keep him in the hospital, which is very difficult and not anything that anybody wants to get into. But we're talking, as it was at least in this film, about life or death decisions.
Right.
Good question here in the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been a very powerful day. I really want to thank you. I loved what Angie said about one person can change your life, one person can save your life, is what it popped into my brain. So I just want to make an observation and then a question. I noticed in the last 10 years or so, young people, 10 years old, 12, 15, after school, there'll be 4 of them sitting on the bench here in Sag Harbor, clearly after school out playing with their friends, all 4 on their cell phones looking at their cell phone. Or a kid driving with their parent hour to go somewhere. The kid is in the back seat staring at their cell phone, not talking to their parents. So here's, 6, 8, 10 years of a kid's life. The most, as you said, their brains are changing. These hours, some of these kids are on their phones 4, 6, 8 hours per day. Not to mention at night, the phones are in their room and they're not getting that sleep that you discussed. So is the community, the mental health community, aware of this, or is it just in my head? And what's being done about it? I think it's contributing to this whole thing. Thank you.
Of course we are. Of course we are well aware of that. I think parents are, but who's buying the phone too? The kids are not buying the phones, right? So I think it's all about also teaching, because it's like you giving a candy to a baby and expect that the baby does not eat the candy, right? So it's going to be very difficult. So I think it's all about teaching them how to use it properly, because it's a tool. Right now, a phone is a tool that we all need. I think we all have a phone and we know how important it is. But it's also a tool that can harm us if we don't know how to use it and how to measure the usage of that, or how we use it productively, right? And with teens and with adolescents, it's exactly the same. I see a lot of this, parents saying, I have no idea how to talk to my teen because they're on the phone all the time. Well, you have a phone that you can remove from the environment so you can have a conversation. And oftentimes you'll see them, they start talking because they're bored, because they don't have a distraction, right? And they will have that conversation flow. And so it's a matter of also not being mean by removing the phone, but also taking action. Okay, you cannot have a conversation, but what are you doing about it? You cannot just sit and expect that your adolescent is going to come and say, hey, yeah, I'm ready to talk, right? So it is an issue we all are aware of, but it's also a lot of educating, not just for adolescents, but for parents, of how to remove that without causing a whole scene or making it so difficult. I know you want to add something.
Well, yeah, this is something we talked about earlier, and then we've all been talking about. Did everyone notice that Nicholas never had a phone in the entire movie? His father was on the phone and you heard it buzzing all the time. That is a strange choice. I mean, just from the construction of the film, I don't understand what that was, because it's so far from reality, as you pointed out. I think there is so much talk about smartphones, social media. There's no doubt that these phones, whether we're adults or children, they create a different connection with our brain than something that existed before these phones existed. There's a lot of research looking at MRIs of what the effects are, and there is almost like an addiction model where there's a neurochemical in our head called dopamine that will spike, And when you get a like on Facebook and then you want to get more, and it sort of keeps you on looking at the next TikTok video, and it is designed to really hardwire right into the structures of our brains. So there's also evidence, this has been talked about a lot, that in around 2010, I think it was, somewhere in the early 2000s, the iPhone model with the camera that faced us, that allowed selfies to be taken and people to do all the, and social media, that within a year, Instagram came about after that. That if you look at adolescent depression during that time, it has increased. Now, I don't want to say that that's the sole factor, because I think there was already signs with our modern lives that this was happening, but there's no doubt that it's a factor. What Angie and I were talking about before the movie, though, and she's just described this to all of you today, is that these instruments are part of our lives. We're not going to get rid of them, and they can be used to be therapeutic and helpful too. So we don't want to be totally black and white and throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to think, as Angie said, about responsible use and where they might actually help us in the future, because we can get to teens. That means also, as we were talking about on the macro level, what do we have to say to government and to these tech companies about the responsibility they have? And so these are things that we need to be thinking about, again, not just on the individual level.
Yeah. And we need to do more research, both clinical, looking at our cases, but also epidemiological research. Like, for example, there is one study that shows the way in which adolescents use the cell phone really affects the level of their depression. So if they use it to create a false identity or to create an identity and they don't really have one, that's the most pathological kind of use. But if they use it to seek social connection, that's a healthier impetus. So again, I totally support the idea of limiting cell phone use, but we have to look at how is the individual using the cell phone? What function is it serving for them? So I think, do we have room or time for one more? Just one more question. Okay. Hi, I guess we won't take it from the pile. Julie, go ahead.
I'm just curious, kids and adolescents and teenagers are very intelligent. And, you know, those parents in the movie were desperate for information. They didn't know what to do. My kids are just newly 17 and 18. There's been times, I suppose, where I'm like, woo, I could use some support myself. But is there a study where the kids are participating and helping to tell parents, this is what we need, this is how we want you to talk to us? I mean, they put themselves under pressure. They're under pressure to get good grades. I'm sure everybody here can remember, like, you want your parents to be proud of you. Whether your parent was successful or unsuccessful or wherever they are in life, you're always going to strive to make mommy and daddy proud, or whoever their guardians are, or aunts and uncles. And I'm just, I think we have to trust the kids too to teach us, because I think they're highly intelligent. I'm just wondering if they're included in these conversations. Like, what can you teach us to how we can be better parents for you?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Quickly, I know we're running out of time, but something that we've been learning a lot with YouthConnect and with going to school districts is that the best programs for teens are the ones that are led by teens. So it's usually, we adults created this program for you kids, so come and join us. It never works. Like, there is these programs also that are very fear-based. So we tell them, hey, this is not good. This is what is going to happen if you do this and that. Never worked. So we have been learning that right now, even with YouthConnect, teens are part of our team. They come and tell us, okay, this is what can go better with the line, with the presentations. This is what we need now. So we're trying to incorporate that to be more like a model where teens are telling us what to do and we follow that, not us telling them. And it turns out to be more successful because it's what they need, just as you mentioned. And even that's an approach that parents can take. You know, like asking them, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to handle this? Or how would you like me to have a conversation with you? Those questions can give you much more information than anything else.
Yes, and I would add to that, absolutely. Teen-led programs, I think, is so important, and also parent-led programs. So multiple family groups where parents come together to support each other. There is research that shows that that really is helpful for the teen or for the adolescent, because the parents are getting the support they need. We can't forget about them. You can see the terrible distress, even though he wasn't a likable character, of Nicholas's father, Peter. You can see him beginning to fall apart in the course of that movie and just be completely bewildered and have no place to turn. And of course, you know, he wasn't strong enough or insightful enough to be able to seek out treatment for himself. But I think it's really important for the parents to have these multiple family groups. And there are some organizations on Long Island which support parents who are dealing with kids who have difficulties. Anyway, okay, I think we have to wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
You really made this. Okay, and don't hesitate to look at the information. I'm sorry, those of you who turned in the cards, we didn't get to all of your questions. They're very good questions. And, you know, I'm very appreciative that people stayed and took it so seriously, and all your contributions. So thank you.